ideology anyway. And it started to spark this conversation, and necessarily so, I think, about how Black religious traditions have spoken to the social needs of Black folk in this country in terms of finding justice and equity and so on. Now in 2014, in an era where people can feel like to make a move for social justice is to tweet a $10 donation for a cause, where does that stand? I mean, is that still relevant? Or are we in an era where people are beginning to say, we'll consign that to history, it's time to do something different?
Well, I think part of the response has to look at and reflect on what Black liberation theology was, and that might give us some inroads and insight on what it still is today, because actually many churches that don't make the headlines of the various media outlets, not NPR, of course.
Of course.
Because I was on that.
Exactly.
But other major outlets. Black liberation theology, when we talk about Black liberation theology, one of the first things we have to realize that it was started in Black churches. It is probably the only American theology that did not come out of the academy. There were pastors and church administrators who initiated Black liberation theology specifically on July 31st, 1966. And what they set out to do was to try to reinvigorate or to refocus precisely on Black people's struggle for justice, whether it was civil rights, whether it was Black power, or whether it was for, of course, on a spiritual level. But in the phrase Black liberation theology, the theology part means that Black liberation theology comes out of the historical tradition of the Christian church. The liberation part speaks to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is primarily focused on poor people, oppressed people, working class people, and those who are bruised. And then the Black part is how is the gospel of Jesus Christ coming out of the historical church tradition revealed in African American culture today and historically. That's what basically the phrase means, those three aspects. So the key thing in terms of what's the status or needed for it today is that people produced it. We may write about it, but people produced it. And there's certain causes that underlie the structure and status of Black people in this part of the world, the United States, that were put in place, obviously in August 1619, when 17 men and 3 women were brought here by force to Jamestown, Virginia, up until today. And although those of us who had the privilege to be in the middle class, professional class, or maybe the 1% of the Black population have made some gains, the majority of African American people are worse off today statistically than they were before the Civil Rights Movement. That's the basis of Black liberation theology.
So if I could jump in, so it sounds like where you're going is that there is still a need, even though it may seem kind of like a thing from the 60s in an era of Twitter and Facebook, that statistically speaking, there is still a need for this kind of a larger grassroots conversation, theologically based, about the needs of people of color, even in an era where Twitter and Facebook can be very equalizing, that if you look at the hard numbers, that need has never gone away. Indeed, it is deep.
Right. I mean, we can also use the technology of different generations to help facilitate Black liberation theology. So to me, it's not a binary either or, but it's a both and. You know, technology is created by women and men to serve women and men. And I have 2 daughters, and they know how to Facebook, your mama book, and everything else that they do. I have no idea. Actually, I helped one of the brothers in here find out about Google today. He'd never heard of Google. So.
Never heard of Google. Well, Google has heard of you.
But again, still, technology is created by human beings and to serve human beings. The key issue is what vision will technology use? And that's one of the issues we talked about, debated about this morning, is when we talk about which way forward, the question is the vision. The question is the vision. We look at the Black Panther Party, and a lot of these posters that we use on our walls in high school and college bring back many memories as we walk in this room. The power of the Black Power movement to me in the United States was that there was a vision that poor people, Black people, needed to have a major transformation systemically in America. Therefore, technology, organizations, networkings, as we call it, then united fronts, all work for that vision. So today, we need a re-envisioning so we have a more clear vision. That's part of the challenge perpetuate forward on this side of the Atlantic, African American. A lot of this due to the men and women in the mirror, those of us who are now a little gray-haired, that we have to do a self-critique and a self-check to put forth this vision in conversation with the new energy of our children and our grandchildren today.
Reverend Boesak, let me try to build on that in light of an article that actually the Associated Press put out today, as fate would have it, about George Bezos, who was the attorney who represented Nelson Mandela in that trial where he was sent away for a life sentence, in which he said, "I'm willing to die for my ideas if it needs to be." One of the quotes in the article from Mr. Bezos, in terms of what South African leaders are doing today, and in his assessment maybe falling short of their commitment to uphold that legacy, he says, quote, "The idea that a legacy can be fulfilled to the nth degree is too optimistic, but I do believe that we should remind them, the leaders, them constantly of what the leader that they praise stood for."
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, of course. Mandela's legacy is not so much to brag about, but it's something to embody. And it begins with the people who have put their lives on the line, even whilst we did not even know him, and it is the responsibility of the leaders to take up the hopes and the dreams and the ideals of the people and translate that into political and socio-economic reality. And so it doesn't help to be praising Mandela, but you see that the gap between the rich and the poor in South Africa today is the widest that exists in the world. So we're messed up as far as that's concerned. It does not help to claim Mandela's legacy if women do not feel that they are protected in South Africa, that their rights are curtailed, if gender violence is such a huge problem. It does not help that we have a wonderful constitution reflecting some of what Mr. Mandela stood for, and we cannot make South Africa a safe place for our children or for God's LGBTI children, and we hunt them down as if it's nothing. So in many, many very, very fundamentally important ways, to talk about the legacy or to claim Mandela's greatness in the eyes of the world is almost sinful if you are not committed to make it happen and make it real. So for the young people, if we say we had Mandela, most admired man in our times, and yet for them, the opportunity to make a life, to go to school, to get away from poverty, to create opportunities for themselves, those opportunities are simply not there because we have the masses of our people who are impoverished and still remain so, whilst we have a system that enriches a very small black elite. That is not what our struggle was all about.
Do you think we are in some ways intoxicated by the idea of Nelson Mandela, by the idea of Martin Luther King, and we feel like, wow, we had a Mandela, we had a Martin, you know, we've got a black president now, gee, things are great, and that kind of lulls us into the sense of, well, I guess we did it.
Well, we are not so much intoxicated by the idea of Mandela, we are intoxicated by the power that the idea of Mandela gave us, and by the privileges it brought a few. And that is what keeps so many people. And so the idea to respond to the Mandela idea and the Mandela ideal does not come up with us. And so we have wonderful policies on paper. If you look at the ANC policies in South Africa, it's actually quite amazing. But if you as a government, your first responsibility is to put the policies in place, and your second responsibility is to make sure that the budget is there to make those policies come real. The third responsibility is that you put people in place who can actually work, who are not lazy, who are not corruptible, who will not be incompetent, and who will dedicate their lives to make those policies come real in the lives of the people who need it most. If you don't do that, then you're not worth the name government.
I heard you both mention in your remarks so far about a handful, getting some of the benefits of the progress that's been made. how much do you think in terms of where we go from here, Reverend Hopkins, that it, I have this conversation sometimes with my colleagues, sometimes with other people, and when we talk about specifically the issues that affect Black people. And they'll ask me, what do you think you should do? What do you think we should do? I was like, I really don't know. I wish if I had to answer, I'd be in a different pay grade. I don't know the answer. And the conversation comes up in terms of whether the people who have been benefited, who have these lovely white-collar jobs and position and status and so on, have the responsibility to reach back and say, let me help pull you up. Or whether the people who are struggling, who would see the ideal, have the responsibility to reach up and pull themselves upward. And I always get into this conversation about, well, I don't see why it has to be one or the other. But then the conversation becomes, well, it's got to start somewhere. Where do we start?
Well, again, I don't think it's a binary. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and. And we have lessons within the African American tradition in the United States about how we can sort of frame the implementation of this vision. I mean, we can look at the Black Women's Club movement of the 1900s. Their theme was to lifting as we climb. We have this sort of folk wisdom amongst Black people, each one teach one. So there are slogans, there are mechanisms, there are ways to do it. It was mentioned earlier in the introduction that we need to no longer have these silos. We need to work more in coalitions because, as we say, we're all in this together. So one, to see it as both ends, which some of us call a very Afrocentric worldview. Two, we need to study and learn from our own history. One of the things we talked about earlier this morning was that there's a culture in America that is this microwave culture. I want it now, based on my experience, get it and quit it. We have to exhale and look at the long view of history. That patience brings rewards for those who wait, literally. So that's another thing. And the other thing is that there are lots of resources, lots of impulses of energy in the African American community. We have progressive churches. I don't mean the right-wing churches, and that's what they are theologically, not the individuals, but theologically they're right-wing. We've got this institution, which I cannot believe. I'm sitting here. This is awesome. Yeah, this museum. We've got progressive people in Marin County with San Francisco Theological Seminary. We've got like the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. We've got even some progressive NFL Black. I mean, it's just people are out there. I'm a perpetual optimist, a pragmatic optimist, but an optimist nonetheless. And so I see we have resources, and people are doing things on the ground. Who knows about? I mean, I didn't know about this. So people on the ground are doing things. So part of the responsibility of those who have lived a little longer, those of us who have been engaged in things from the 60s to now, is precisely that, is to try to remind, try to work with, and come together with those who are younger. And the people who are younger, there is a sense of responsibility that everyone has responsibility, so I agree with that. But again, the responsibility is trained into young people. I'll give you an example. People will say, well, these children, my child is acting a fool, right? Well, actually, they're imitating parents. Okay, so they didn't just come out of the womb after 9 months acting like this.
They looked at you.
Yeah, they looked at you, exactly. So we have a responsibility, they have a responsibility, but I really do think that those of us who know, or those of us who have experienced, and those of us who have the resources on the ground, we need to come together and provide another model, another program, another vision for those who are much younger than us.
Let me shift over to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. One of the things that I always have to remind people about when we talk about the March on Washington is that it was the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. That it wasn't just about making people feel warm and fuzzy, but that there was a lot of pragmatic work that had to happen. That he was, the last thing he did before he was shot dead at the balcony of the Lorraine Motel was a labor dispute for sanitation workers. At what point it seems like that there's a point where people are very warm and fuzzy about the idea of bringing people together and solving societal ills, and then the rubber hits the road, and the details come in, and the work comes in, and then the bright lights of the legacies of people like Mandela and Dr. King begin to feel remote, like, oh, this is complex, and we're talking about dealing with old issues and reconciling things that happened back then. Can't we just forget it and move forward? Talk to me about what we learned, what we take from those legacies in terms of just doing the hard, gritty work of actually reconciling the past so we can move forward.
I think that there are people throughout this land and communities, particularly African American communities, whether it's in Harlem, or whether it's the south side and west side of Chicago, or whether it's East Oakland, or wherever we want to go, who are involved, Roxbury and Boston, who are involved in this work. They are involved in this work. I think one of the things that the ruling class in this country have done is perpetuate this myth, which is actually a lie, that black people have given up on struggle. We have not. I can name progressive black churches who are doing things on the ground. Some of them don't have the profiles of a Trinity United Church of Christ where President Obama was there for 15 or 20 years. There are others who have done very nice things. I mean, there are aesthetic institutions such as this. I want to call my daughters and tell them to fly here to see this. But we just are being inundated through Twitter and Quitter and whatever that's going on, that our kids and we are also primarily concerned about just survival. It is that, but there are other people doing things. So we've got to get the message out. So how do we connect this work here, grassroots work here, what's happening in Chicago? What's happening in Cape Town? You know, so I know my limited experience, I'm sure we all know in our own experiences, that our people are working. They are working. And as a theologian and as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, I never give up hope. Because if we give up hope, then it's over already. They have completed their task. So I say that let us not be lulled to sleep or become frustrated and disappointed, absolutely, because of what the media portrays. We all know, as we look at these posters, you know, that the media can do all kinds of things. Many of you know who were around. There was a big debate between Oakland headquarters of Black Panther Party and Black Panther Party in New York. Well, it came to find out that the FBI did false stationery, signed signatures, and sent it to Black Panther Party in Oakland. We all know there are other forms of skullduggery that people who have power in this country will do to us. I was in New York City in the 70s when the government and the hospitals there did sterilization of Puerto Rican women and African American women. We know of the Tuskegee Institute. We know what the powers that be will do. Our job is not to react to them. Our job is to, as we say, gird up our loins. We didn't come here to preach, but if we got to go there. But that's the liberation part of it, that we have got to work. And there are people in the field today who are working. There are black young people who are doing gospel rap, not just gangster rap. And they're mixing in Huey Newton, they're mixing in Malcolm X. It's just phenomenal. The corporate America is not going to show them to the world. That's our job. We can't look anywhere else. It's up to us. It's the man and woman in the mirror. And that's my sermon to my generation and to my daughter's generation. Don't wait for Malcolm. Don't wait for Martin. Don't wait for Fannie Lou Hamer. We have to do it. We are Martin. We are Malcolm. In the Spike Lee's movie, he says, I'm Malcolm X. Remember that?
Yes.
We're Malcolm X. We're Fannie Lou Hamer.
I remember when that movie came out, and I was part of a youth group with Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity, and they corralled, I think it was 60 of us. We all went to the theater, we saw Malcolm X, and I just sat for 3 hours just like mesmerized, because I never knew that story until then. And then we talked about that very thing, about how you take that kind of action and not just make it a movie or a cap with an X that you wear, but that you make something real.
Yeah. Well, one of the most important things I thought that Nelson Mandela said was when he spoke to the youth, and he repeated towards the end a number of times so that they could understand, it is in your hands now. So he knew it was ready to go. He had done what he had to do. It was up to us to take it forward. And I, like Dr. Hopkins, I have great faith in our people. I was part of a movement in South Africa that did not have a centralized leadership, sitting in Johannesburg making decisions. Every community, every organization where they were understood the needs, understood the challenges, understood the dynamic, and they called upon us and says, we're going to have a march here, talking about the 1980s, in the hardest time. There was never a darker time in South Africa's life and our history than the late 1970s and right through the 1980s. And in those days, it was the people, the young people, the women, everybody on the ground who took responsibility for our freedom. When we said freedom in our lifetime, we did not mean freedom when somebody comes to lead us out of this. freedom once Nelson Mandela came out of prison, we understood that unless we took that up and made it part of our life mission, Mandela will die in prison. And the struggle will take a different course. And so my faith in people on the ground to realize their historic responsibility is a great one, so I share that with you. And that's what we talk about with young people here and with young people back home. And unless you realize that it's not just about Martin Luther King's legacy or Mandela's legacy, it's about your own legacy. What are you leaving behind? Or what kind of world are you leaving behind? Mandela's now gone, and God will reward him for whatever it is that he had done. But my responsibility is to say, the world in which we live is wrong because this still happens, that still happens, that still happens. What can I do to make it right?
In our last few minutes together, let's talk about some lessons learned, some things we can, some tangible things that we can take with us. I did want to ask you about matters of reconciliation, and maybe we'll have a split second to talk about that going forward. But if we wanted to concretely, in an ideal situation, perfect world, if we really understood the legacies deeply, thoroughly, of Nelson Mandela, of Dr. King, for what they really were, and we said, okay, I'm going to take these, and the distillation of that is this action. I'm going to do this as just everyday guy, not someone who's plugged in, not someone who's educated, part of the elite, the 1%, just as me, everyday Joe, average me. Where to start?
Desmond Tutu on his birthday goes out and gathers the kids in the squatter camps, and they walk around the squatter camp and down the street, and they pick up paper and plastic and clean up. And as they walk, he explains to them what it means to do ecological justice. That the earth is our responsibility now. It's the Lord's, but we live in it. Those kids don't need a long lecture. They need to understand this is what I need to do with my life right now. So they relate that. If the squatter camp remains a dump, and if we are happy to live in filth, and if that does not disturb us, and if we do not say, this is what I'm trying to do, but this is government's responsibility, how we do that together, and the only way to do that is to say to government, I'm picking up my plastic, what are you doing? So you connect what people want to do to change their lives with what government responsibility is, because we entrusted them with power and with resources to do that. And it seems to me that's one thing, and we don't have time to talk about more, but to link those very local situations with global issues that become so overwhelmingly important.
And Reverend Hopkins, one thing, if we could start right where we were, if we fully understood these legacies, what might that inspire us to do as a first step?
When I graduated from college, I moved in Boston, Cambridge actually, and I moved to Harlem to be a community organizer. And what we developed is how we relate to people and live with people where they are. And three things we try to do. One, we try to be clear on our faith in people. That the power of the people is greater than man's technology, for all you closet ex-Panther people out there. That slogan comes with a lot of power in there. So one, that we ourselves believe that the people can change history. Two, that we help people realize that they in fact can do it. We can't help them if we don't believe it. And three, how can we help them have the resources so they can do it wherever they are? There has to be some type of hierarchy or something, but the people themselves wherever they are. And the fourth thing is that each person make a decision that they're going to do something, whether they're going to pick up trash, whether they're going to mentor someone, whether they're going to organize something, and they connect to one other person in their neighborhood, on their block. It has to be there. Because basically the success of all these great movements, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, women's feminist, Black feminist movement, all of those things, was that they link to local and then the global. Then finally, even though it feels like we're in a lull period in the movement because the 50s and 60s were such the heydays, in order for us to prepare for the next flow, we have to dig deep locally now. So the infrastructure will be there so we can ride that way and lead the way. Hopefully it won't be through burning down buildings. I'm a member of the clergy, so I'm not into violence. But I think that as I read human history, that the people who are oppressed, and it's not rhetoric, just common sense. People don't want to be without a job. People don't want to be living in a situation with no hope. They want housing. They want all the basic things that everybody else has in Marin County and in Hyde Park in Chicago. People are going to eat. So those of us who think we're progressive, either church, non-church, or the state realm, we have prepared to lay the foundation to have the infrastructure to lead the next flow that's coming. And the next flow is going to come because the United States as an empire is declining on various levels, but principally because of two spiritual problems. One, greed, and two, mean-spiritedness. That's always been the indication of the decline of a world empire on a spiritual level. That's what's happening now. So there's going to be a flow because of the decadence of superpower.
I hear you on that. I appreciate the insights. I'm glad to hear that despite the greed and the mean-spiritedness, and as a journalist, you ain't lying. I mean, I see what happens just like you see it. But glad to see that you both have hope for this country if we are able to take some of these lessons and move forward with them. Glad to have your insights and glad to have you both with us, the Reverend Dr. Dwight Hopkins and the Reverend Dr. Alan Aubrey Boesak. Thank you very much.